Welcome to Books in Five, where we are interviewing authors of recently published books on relevant topics. I'm very excited to have Vince Beiser here with us as he's written a great new book on a topic that we should all know more about. Vince, thank you so much for joining us here. So, we're going to be asking you 5 questions, and we'll give you about 5 minutes to answer each one. And then at the end, we'll ask you some bonus questions. All right, Vince, let's get started with question number one. Your book explores the explosion in demand for critical metals over the past few decades. Can you help us understand what these elements are, where they are found, and what they are used for?
Sure. It's probably a little easier to come at it from the other end. Basically, what's happening is as we're moving, the world is moving into an era that's going to be defined by renewable energy, right? Solar power, wind power, and electric vehicles, plus digital technology, right? I call it the electro-digital age. Now, this is great in a lot of ways, right? Obviously renewables are much better for the climate, but there's a big catch. And the catch is that to build all that stuff, to build all those cars, all those solar panels, wind turbines, and all the digital gadgets that we use every day, our phones, the computers that you and I are talking on right now, and so on, those things are all made out of metals. So we're going to need billions of tons of a very specific set of what are called critical metals. And that's things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earths, all this stuff that's been in the news a lot recently. There's this howling demand all over the world to find and produce more and more and more of these metals to build all the machinery that we're going to need to make life in the 21st century possible. And the problem is, of course, most of those metals come out of the ground. We have to dig them up from mines. And that means that there's a great paradox in our shift towards renewable energy. And the paradox is that, of course, we need to shift to renewables and we need to shift to electric cars in order to stave off the biggest threat that we face, which is climate change. But at the same time, those solutions are creating environmental havoc of their own. To get those metals that we need, rainforests are being cut to the ground. Children are being put to work in mines. Rivers are being poisoned. And China is gaining already has gained an enormous geopolitical advantage. So there's a whole lot of issues. These things are happening. We're getting these metals from many different countries in many different ways. And there's no easy solution because, we need to build this stuff. We need to build renewable energy. We need our digital tech that's going to require metals. So the real question that we face is how can we get our hands on enough of these metals to enable this transition to the electro-digital age without trashing the planet in the process?
So, we have about 90 more seconds here with this first question. And I know you mentioned China, but which other countries are important producers and supplies of these critical metals?
Yeah. So some of these metals come from, the supply of them is from very specific places. The most famous one, Democratic Republic of Congo, which is right smack in the middle of Africa. That one country supplies 70% of all of the world's cobalt. Cobalt being a crucial ingredient in most batteries, right? There's cobalt in the battery of this laptop I'm talking to you on. There's cobalt in the battery of most electric vehicles out there. 70% of it comes from this one country, which happens to be one of the most corrupt, most chaotic countries in the world. And there's all kinds of issues, terrible working conditions in the mines. There are thousands of children working in those mines. And also there's, part of what's driving, there's been a civil war going on and off there for decades. And part of what's driving it is people fighting over that mineral wealth. So that's a problem. Another place is Chile. So Chile is home to one of the biggest supplies of lithium, which is another crucial part of all our batteries. And we get a huge amount of it from this one area in Chile that's very water stressed. It's already a very, very dry part of the country. And the real mining uses up a lot of water. And there's a lot of concern that lithium mining is going to completely dry out this area. And that could really endanger all kinds of rare animals that live there. There's a certain kind of flamingo that lives there. And not to mention the indigenous people who've lived there for thousands and thousands of years. All of that is being put at risk by this lithium mining.
Great. Let's move on to our second question here. The transition that is currently taking place in the global economy is creating prosperity for people in new industries. What is the upside that you've witnessed as a new cohort of people, countries, and humanity as a whole benefit from mining of these critical minerals?
That's a really good question. So of course there are benefits. There's some people are losing, but a lot of people are gaining. A really good example is Indonesia. So Indonesia has the world's biggest deposits of nickel, which is yet another ingredient in most of our batteries. We use tons and tons of nickel in electric vehicle batteries and all kinds of other batteries. So Indonesia, which is a relatively poor country, recognized this about, 10, 20 years ago. They kind of realized like, oh, wow, we've got a real lock on this incredibly important resource that the world is just going to need more and more and more of. So they had already been mining nickel. They massively expanded their nickel mining operations. And they also have used the profits from that to invest in the next step up the value chain and in building up nickel refining capacities within Indonesia, right? So rather than just getting the raw nickel out of the ground and sending it somewhere else, they're doing more and more of that value added processing within Indonesia itself. And they're making a lot of money, tens of billions of dollars um, of value are accruing to Indonesia from this, which is, great in a lot of ways because Indonesia, like I said, it's a very big country. It's about 200 million people there. It's a very poor country. They really need to, to build up their people's standards of living. So, nickel it's definitely a big money maker for them. At the same time, of course, it is coming at a lot of great environmental cost, right? They've bulldozed hundreds of miles of rainforest to get at that nickel. These processing plants that they've built are incredibly polluting, super dirty. They're also very dangerous. Many dozens and dozens of workers have died in accidents there just in the last few years. So there's serious costs. But at the same time, they are also like those refineries are creating a lot of jobs. So, there's definitely pluses and minuses to it.
And for humanity as a whole, as we transition, as we get more green energy, that is beneficial for us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's a little hard to see here in Canada and in the US because we are really behind much of the rest of the world. But everywhere else, solar power and wind tap power are taking off like crazy. They're by far the fastest growing types of energy that are being deployed. In a lot of places, several countries are now getting more energy from renewables than they are from fossil fuels. China is, which is the world's biggest polluter, biggest carbon emitter, they're on track to be getting most of their energy from renewables very soon. And that is great, right? That is definitely big picture, a big win. And the same goes with electric vehicles, right? Again, here in Canada, where we're sitting, there's electric vehicle sales are growing, but in Europe and in China, they are going through the roof. Most new cars, the majority of new cars that are sold in China now are electric vehicles. And in some parts of Europe, like in Norway, it's upwards of 90%. And that's very good news. Absolutely. I mean, that's a big part of how we, can blunt the threat of climate change. We've got to get people, switch them out of gas-powered vehicles and into electric vehicles, and that's only made possible because of these metals. So yeah, absolutely. We can't have the energy transition without digging up a lot of critical metals. We are digging up a lot of critical metals. The energy transition is happening. It's not happening fast enough nor widely enough, but it is happening.
Great. Let's move on to our third question here, Vince. And you've brought it up a little bit before, but let's really dive into the geopolitical tensions at play. Can you walk us through the implications of this shift in the global balance of power as we mine these critical metals, especially as it relates to China?
Yeah, absolutely. So China is the number one issue when we're talking about this kind of stuff in a geopolitical context. And the reason for that is every single one of these metals that we're talking about, copper, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, the whole list of them, China dominates the supply chain of those metals. So they dig up a lot of those metals within their own borders, within China itself, where they don't have uh, resources of their own. They buy mines abroad or pieces of mines abroad, including here in Canada, including in the US. They own, mines and chunks of mines all over the world. And then no matter where that stuff comes out of the ground, no matter who digs it up, most of it gets sent to China for processing, for that next stage of turning that raw ore, that just rock and rubble, into pure metal. And then once it's been converted into pure metal, Chinese companies take that metal and turn it into most of the world's wind turbines, solar panels, electric cars, batteries. So every step of the chain, every step along the way, China has a really dominant position. And that, is a big concern. And this is exactly why we've been seeing, Donald Trump talking so much in the last few months about wanting to take over Greenland. Why does he want Greenland? Who cares about Greenland? The only reason he wants Greenland is it's full of rare earths and other metals that that the United States needs and that China controls. The Americans are very aware. I mean, the whole Western world has become very aware of how vulnerable this makes them. Right? China has the ability to cut off these incredibly important supplies that we need. So that's why he keeps talking about Greenland. That's why he's so hot on taking over Canada. And let me say, never. But this deal with Ukraine, right? The deal that they cut with Ukraine to get access to Ukraine's mineral wealth, that's all about trying to reduce China's dominance and our dependence on China. Now, all that said, that weapon is starting to come into play already with the trade war that Trump kicked off between the US and China. One of the first things that China did when the US imposed all these tariffs on it was not quite cut off the supply of rare earths, which is one set of critical metals, but they basically like throttled them down, slowed them right down, and sort of made it clear that, if they need to, if they're really pushed, they can and they will cut off these supplies, which would be disastrous for not only for renewable energy, but for the whole digital tech industry. Also, these metals are also used in all kinds of other things, including military technology, healthcare technology. If we don't have these rare earths that China controls, we're really in big, big trouble. And China basically took that card, threw it on the table, and said, we're not playing this just yet, but we can and we will. So,
For a final minute for this question, what other geopolitical actors are important in this story?
yeah, well, so outside of China, there are a bunch of other places that sort of have an important grip, like Indonesia, as I mentioned. So Indonesia is playing their cards very smart. One thing that they've been doing is they've actually banned the export. First, they banned the export of raw nickel, right? So that forces anybody who wants to buy Indonesian nickel, have to go and build a refinery in Indonesia. So Indonesia gets a little more of that money. Their next step, which they're talking about, is to then ban the export of nickel altogether. So if you want to use Indonesian nickel to build a battery, you're going to have to build that whole supply chain within Indonesia itself. So Indonesia is being very clever about how they're basically forcing the rest of the world to sort of come to them, to stop just extracting and like start investing in them a little bit more. And there are other places that are also trying with varying degrees of success. One place that doesn't get enough attention, I think, is Myanmar. Um, so this is a country, they also have loads of rare earths and other metals. And they're in the middle of a huge civil war, right? The country is basically chopped up among all these different warlords. And there's a few of these different areas controlled by these warlords where they've taken over the rare earth mines. So in a very real way, every time that you buy a new digital gadget, a little piece of whatever you paid for it is going to warlords in Myanmar.
Let's move on to our fourth question. Those who are advocating against these extractive corporations and the regulators who enable them are enjoying success in their efforts to either change or stifle mining practices. How has the environmental movement, indigenous groups, and others been able to increase their effectiveness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, all of those actors, environmental groups, indigenous people, local communities that are affected by mining, they have all those groups are much more effective and much more powerful than they were, let's say 50 years ago when the environmental movement first really kind of got into gear. It's not to say like the playing field is still tilted against them, right? If it's them versus a gigantic mining corporation, the mining corporation still has more leverage, but it's not nearly as lopsided as it used to be. Um, and you can really see that in all kinds of ways. I mean, mostly in environmental regulations, right? To open up a mine in the US or Canada today is much, much, much more difficult than it was 50 years ago. And, just because of all the regulations that you have to meet, all the consultation that you have to do with local communities, with indigenous groups. This is the law in some places, and in a lot of places, it's just come to be understood as part of doing business, because if you don't do it, you're going to have protests, you're going to have boycotts, you're going to have lawsuits, and it's going to cost you more in the long run than it would have to just do it right in the first place. So, and you can see this in the length of time that it takes to open a new mine. So back in the like 1950s or so, the average time that it took from like discovering a new deposit of copper or whatever to opening a new mine took about 3-4 years. Now it's more like 15 to 20 years because there's so many more hoops that they have to go through. So, this is good in a lot of ways, right? Where mining is it's always harmful, but it's less harmful than it used to be. Generally speaking, mining companies are paying more attention and making sure that at least some benefits flow to the local folks. Um, the downside is, all that extra cost and all that extra time means that um, fewer mines are getting opened. And the problem there is, like I said, we do need a lot of these metals for the energy transition. So there's a real concern that at a certain point, we're just not going to have enough copper and everything else coming out of the ground to build all the electric vehicles that we need for the energy transition. So there's a real potential for a real crunch point coming soon.
We got about another minute. Vince, what role do consumer advocates and consumer groups play in ensuring that these mining companies are not profiting too much or not despoiling the environment too much?
Yeah, I think this one's a little bit difficult for individuals, like for individual consumers to really have an impact on, because we're not really the customers of mining companies, right? It's different from like, tuna or something like that, where there's been really successful consumer campaigns, because they don't like, I don't know about you, but I don't go around buying, 8 tons of lithium very often, right? No, we buy the phone with the battery in it. Um, but we can definitely, it is definitely important for people to raise their awareness of this kind of stuff, and to put pressure on the companies, the manufacturers of these devices, to clean up their supply chains, to make sure that their supply chains don't include child labor, that they're not coming at the cost of massive environmental devastation and so on. The last thing I'll say is that if you really want to make a difference, I think the most important thing that we as individuals can do is to try to reduce the amount that we consume, right? That will do more than anything to reduce all the problems that come with it. And the number one thing we can do, the piece of equipment that we consume that takes up by far the most metals and energy is vehicles, even electric vehicles. So electric vehicle, better than a gas-powered vehicle for sure. But you know what? If you can live your life in such a way that you can get around on bicycle, public transit, on foot, whatever, and you don't have to own a vehicle, that is by far the best thing you can do for the planet.
Let's move on to our fifth question here, Vince. You jumped the gun a little bit, but our fifth question is really going to focus on what you just spoke about, which is your book concludes with the revelation that the apparent benefits of switching from fossil fuels to this new green energy are not so apparent. Rather than trading one form of pollution for another, what should we be focusing on?
Okay. So then, like I was saying, the number one thing that we as consumers can do is this. If at all possible, don't buy a car, not even an electric one, which is not to say that all cars are bad or that you're a bad person if you own a car. I mean, I own a car. Maybe I'm a bad person, but it's not because I own a car. And lots of people need cars. That's not, I'm not saying that everybody should get rid of their cars. What I am saying is that cars are by far the most energy intensive, the most material intensive things that any of us own, except for your house if you own a house. And if we end up switching, there's about 1.2 billion gasoline powered cars on the roads right now worldwide. If we switch 1.2 billion cars for 1.2 billion electric cars, we're just going to swap one set of problems for another, right? So much better is, if at all possible, to just reduce the number of cars that are out there. And the way to do that is to try to find ways to build our cities and to live our lives such that we don't need to own a car. Because the big problem right now, especially here in North America, is in lots of places, you don't have a choice, right? You absolutely have to have a car to get to work, to go shopping, whatever. You got to drive a long way. And that's because that's how our the environment that we live in is designed that way. It doesn't have to be that way, right? I mean, in many parts of Europe and in other places where people live more densely, where there's more transit built out, where there's more bicycle infrastructure so that it's safe and easy to get from place to place on a bicycle, people live just as well as we do here. They have just the same standard of living, but fewer of them own cars because they just don't need them. And I mean, I can tell you from my own personal experience that this is not just some pie in the sky idea. It works in the real world. Like, so I used to live in Los Angeles with my wife and our two kids. And of course, we had two cars there, right? You need two cars to get around in LA. Basically, every grown up needs a car if you're going to get anywhere. Then about 5 years ago, we moved back to Vancouver, which is my hometown. And right away, we got rid of one of those cars. And it wasn't because, all of a sudden, like, oh, we're in Canada, we're environmental angels. No, it was just because we didn't need the thing, because Vancouver has really done a lot to sort of retrofit itself so that you don't need a car quite as much, right? There's a really good bicycle network. There's decent public transit. They've done a lot to make neighborhoods more walkable, safer, all that kind of stuff. And so the result is we were just like, well, we can get by with just one car. And that's great because that saves so much money and so much hassle and stress. It's one less car you got to worry about insuring and maintaining and repairing and what's the resale value. Just getting rid of that car, it was a big quality of life boost to me. And listen, Vancouver is a modern city of a couple of million people. Um, there's no reason that what's been done here can't be done in other places. And the good news is those kinds of changes are happening in lots of places, especially in Europe, but also in a lot of places in the US and Canada.
Got it. And you brought it up, which is the benefits to your household of saving money, but also the benefits to the world because the demand for another vehicle just isn't out there. And we need millions, if not billions, of people not to buy, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Great, Vince. Thank you so much for joining us. These are our five questions for Books in Five. Let's move on to our bonus questions now, Vince.
There's a bonus. Okay.
So, Vince, you've been an investigative journalist for a long time now. How did you get into that? Why is that your passion?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I got into it pretty much by accident, to be honest with you. Um, Way back when I was in college, I was very caught up with the whole I got a degree in Middle Eastern studies and I studied Arabic and I was very caught up with the whole Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I decided after I graduated, I was just going to go over there and fix it. So that's why there's no more problems over there. You can thank
Yeah.
me for that. But anyway, so I went over there and I didn't know what to do, but I wanted to just sort of get into the mix and do something that was going to be useful and helpful somehow. And the first job that came my way was a job with a local news agency. And I was just like, okay, this is actually something, the main thing that I'd learned in college was how to take a lot of information and boil it down into, a smaller digestible chunk, turn it into a research paper or something. And what I really wanted to do was like get out there, be in the middle of the action and see all the people who were making things happen. And it turns out those two things are what journalists do. Best case, sometimes we can make a difference, right? By shining a spotlight on bad things and also by shining a spotlight on good things and raising awareness and all that kind of stuff. So it was just a good fit. So I just kind of fell into it and haven't been able to get out since.
Vince, what is an accomplishment that you are most proud of? And I'm assuming you're going to say the Daily Show appearance.
That was really fun, I have to say. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm proud of it. I don't know if that's the thing I'm proudest of, but it was one of the funnest for sure. Yeah, man. I mean, getting flown out to New York and the whole, rock star for a day treatment and then being on the show that's seen by millions of people. Yeah, that was lots and lots of fun.
Okay, maybe give us your real answer then.
um, yeah, I think it's a bit abstract, but I really feel like what I'm proudest of is I really do think that I've helped to raise awareness about some really obscure topics that most people never even think about, but that I know more people are now thinking about because of my work, right? It's pretty rare that you get to do that in journalism. Like usually, you write an article about whatever the issue is and you send it out there in the world and you don't know, like you have no idea if anybody reads it or what difference it makes. But with my books, at least, I know like, a lot of people have gotten in touch with me over the years to say, wow, your book really changed how I think. Wow, I'm gonna like people have like decided to do their PhD theses on what I write, and they've like brought it to their companies, like, oh, we're gonna change how we do stuff because I read your book. And that's really the most gratifying thing because that ultimately that's the bottom line. That's what I'm trying to do here is to try to do a little good in the world. And every time I get a little indication that I've made a little bit of difference, that's the best.
No, Vince, you've definitely made a positive impact. Our final bonus question for you is, what are you working on next?
So I'm trying to develop my next book now, which I hope is going to be about scavengers, about the millions of people making billions of dollars off what the rest of us throw away. So it's a fascinating subject. There's all kinds of amazing stories there. I'm trying to figure out how to turn it into a book. Wish me well.
You will definitely be welcome back when that is out, Vince. Thank you so much for joining us on Books in Five. We are here with Vince Beiser, and he is the author of the book Power Metal. Definitely go buy it, read it, check it out from the library, and learn more about this relevant topic.
Thanks. And if I can just add one thing, also, if any of this is of interest to you folks, I also write a weekly newsletter, also called Power Metal, that sort of is like keeps you up to date on the latest in all these issues. It's at powermetal.substack.com.
I will include that in the show notes for sure, Vince. Thank you so
Beautiful.
much for joining us. The host of Books in Five is Bhavan Sodhan. Books in Five is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.